In my last video, I talked about how IQ does not predict life success, particularly when you are looking at people of average to above average intelligence. But there is actually a psychometric tool which is as widely accepted as IQ, which does predict life success, and that is the Big Five or Ocean Personality Inventory. And I mentioned in a couple of videos now, these are the two most widely accepted psychometric instruments, at least in the West, and I break both of them in a variety of ways. And I know obviously the IQ one is going to be of more interest to people, and that's coming. But before I do that, I want to drive home how important it is to understand the Big Five Ocean Personality Inventory, and I'll talk about how I break that too. Because again, people tend to dramatically overestimate how much IQ matters to both professional and to life success and happiness, and underestimate how much personality does. And when people are thinking about personality, they're usually looking at the Myers-Briggs Personality Inventory, which is a popular tool, but it's honestly terrible. It takes out the most important of the big five factors, neuroticism, which is the best predictor of life success, and then it treats everything as discrete binary buckets, when in fact it's a Gaussian, a bell curve, and most people are towards the center. So it is not predictive, and I will link a lot of the things I'm talking about. There are videos or articles by Spencer Greenberg of Clearer Thinking, which he is accessible, and he matches what I've learned, so I'm going to just be using him if you want more information in the description below. And so anyways, surprisingly, even with like your GPA in college and high school, personality as judged by the Big Five personality test is at least as big a factor as your IQ score. And for pretty much everything else, it's not even a competition. Personality dramatically outweighs your IQ results. And so the Big Five, Ocean, stands for openness, conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And I have talked about one of my best performing short videos, Bryan Caplan's signaling hypothesis in this book, The Case Against Education, where he says that basically the vast majority of the value of a college degree, even in STEM fields, isn't what you learn. It is showing employers that you are smart enough to get into college, conventional enough to go, and diligent enough to finish, which diligent correlates with conscientiousness, conventionality with agreeableness. And people also, like there was a thing I saw on hyperemployability versus unemployability, and the two biggest factors in making people unemployable are if they are low in conscientiousness or low in agreeableness. And so these factors, they're going to determine like how you do on a job. If you are in a role that doesn't require a college degree, they will often give you psychometric inventories that are looking at these factors, and possibly, I've heard, neuroticism as well, which again, neuroticism is the biggest predictor of life happiness, life success, which, I mean, who'd have thought that whether or not you are a massive basket case who is always in your own head would predict how well you're doing in life and how happy you are within your life? Big shock, right? And then after that, typically, extraversion comes next, followed by conscientiousness pretty closely, and then agreeableness, with openness not really mattering that much. And I've seen different results, but roughly that's the ordering. So within Western cultures, these tests, which are, again, like you're getting a percentile score, are a pretty good predictor of your employment success, your income, and your overall like life success and life satisfaction. And they're also used both as a proxy, as Bryan Caplan talks about in The Case Against Education, and directly by employers to hire you. And what you find with the Big Five, the Ocean, is that you tend to get pretty consistent scores across time, no matter what your mood is, even though it's based on self-report, unless you have a big life event. And I actually illustrated here. So my scores before and after my father died, because I have always gotten, and this has not changed, I've always gotten above the 99th percentile in openness. And before my father died, I always got above the 99th percentile in neuroticism, and then after his death, it went down to about 50th percentile. I've been trying to get it lower, but I haven't actually taken a Big Five test recently. Maybe I should have done this before this video, but I was writing a blog post sort of explaining everything I'm going to say, which I'm linking, and I wanted to film this before it got dark out. I also, to a lesser degree, after my father died, I started scoring a little better on agreeability. Doesn't quite show this, but I went from about 40th percentile typically to about 60th, and with conscientiousness, I went from scoring about the 30th percentile to the 40th percentile. But I kind of break three of these dimensions. I would say that my score on openness tends to be pretty reliable, and my score on neuroticism tends to be pretty reliable. And when I say reliable, I mean valid. That's something you need to understand is in psychometrics, the difference between reliability and validity. And so reliability is how internally consistent it is, how much you're going to get the same test under the same conditions. And that is the bigger indictment of a psychometric instrument, is if it's not reliable. You can have psychometric instruments that are not necessarily valid. And I'm also going to note there's two kinds of validity. So there's predictive validity, which is it predicting, for example, life success or how you're going to do in employment? And then descriptive validity, does it actually describe what it says it describes? And I'll get into that a little bit more. But the point is, when it comes to IQ tests, I actually break the reliability of these tests, which is considered the bigger indictment, although all the ways I do are well documented in the psychometric literature. That is to say, if you give me the same test, the same IQ test, in the same circumstances, I am not going to get the same score. Pretty reliably, I'm not going to get the same score, breaking the reliability. With the big five, unless life circumstances change, as I said, my results have been pretty reliable. So then the question becomes, are there problems with validity, and particularly with predictive validity? Because if it's just my self-image is that it doesn't match, well, who cares, right? Not the designers of these instruments. However, so I do, on 3 of these scores, again, openness, I think is right. Neuroticism, I think is right. But I'll start with extroversion, because that's the relatively easy one, which is that I have, throughout most of my life, gotten about 40th percentile on extroversion, which would make me an ambivert based on that. But I know a lot of ambiverts, and I don't relate to them. These are people, they go to, they like going to clubs and things and, crowded parties that I cannot stand. They have the need to interact with people on, if not a daily basis, at least a couple times a week. Whereas I could happily spend easily a week not interacting with anybody, and certainly even a month I could, as long as I had books and stuff I was doing. And so at the same time, these ambiverts will talk about how I seem more extroverted because I seem more confident. And so what's going on with that? Well, it turns out that if you break down the submetrics of extroversion, and I learned this from the Hexaco, which shows you your submetrics, although not as granularly as your metrics, in order to show how they rearrange them. There is one submetric in extroversion called social boldness. And again, I don't know granularly, but it's well above 90%. I'm well above the 90th percentile on social boldness. And everything else in extroversion, I'm anywhere from low to very low. And that actually makes sense if you understand that cross-culturally, the big five reduces to, depending on who you ask, 2 or 3 factors. And so I always learned 2, which are dominance and affiliation, which happen to map on really well to what I've described are the 2 fundamental human social motivations, agency and communion. Although I actually, so Spencer Greenberg, whose stuff I'm linking, I emailed him about this, and he's like, well, actually, the more reliable or the better work says there's actually 3, which are affiliation, dynamism, and order. And that is based on more studies that are looking at the terms within cultures as opposed to trying to just see how the existing items map on. We'll get 3 results instead of 2, but there are studies which have gotten 2 results, and because it works better for mapping onto agency and communion, I'm using it. But regardless, whether you're treating it as dominance or dynamism in the 2 or 3 factor model, well, social boldness is basically how willing I am to do things people would consider socially risky if there's a reason for me doing it. And I think a great example of this is I have absolutely no fear of public speaking, which is one of the things that makes doing YouTube relatively easy for me, at least. Like I said, you can give me an assignment to give a talk in 15 minutes about something I know nothing about to an audience of experts on that topic, and I will do it happily. I know I'm going to get a bunch of stuff wrong, and then I know I'm going to get the experts asking a bunch of questions and giving me corrections that are going to teach me about the topic, so happy to do that. And that's just kind of how I am. Like, I really have no fear of social situations unless people have hammered it into my head that I should have a fear, and even then it's pretty easy for me to overcome. I will have anxiety, but like, if there's a reason for me to do social stuff, I have no problem doing it. Although actually, if I have to drive in traffic, especially highway traffic, that can become an obstacle, but that's not social. That's just, I hate driving in traffic. And anyways, so the other thing about extroversion, introversion that I've realized, and I've talked about the double empathy problem on my blog, I think a little bit on this channel, and I have a short coming out on that, which I might actually move up because I keep referencing it, is that there's this question with autism. Do we actually have a defect in cognitive empathy? Or is it simply the fact that we are expected to understand people who are different from us, neurotypical people who are the majority, and they are not expected to understand us? And I think at least for autistic people who are also gifted, it's probably entirely down to understanding people different from us. And so then the question is, well, like, one of the markers of introversion, and I didn't pull, I have, but I didn't read Quiet by Susan Cain, I know the general idea, is she argues that it's basically, are you energized by social interactions, in which case you're an extrovert, or you're drained by social interaction, in which case you're an introvert? And well, if I think about it, when I'm dealing with family, I'm typically energized by social situations. If I'm like giving a talk on something where I have like sort of a structure that I'm following, again, social boldness, I'm at least not drained and often energized. And if I'm interacting with people I relate to strongly, who are very rare, but I'm always excited to find them, I am generally at least slightly energized by that. And so the question is, well, am I actually introverted, or is this just an adaptive strategy from most people are not like me, and therefore most people are draining to deal with on any extended basis? But then the question also becomes, well, in that case, are there actually real introverts, or is it just a coping strategy from people who are weird and have trouble relating to people? So I don't know, but that's one where you would expect it to have good predictive validity either way, so it's not relevant. However, the social boldness one actually measures, because on one hand, people who are sort of more typical ambivert profile, they're going out, they're doing stuff, they're meeting people, which is going to help them, and I'm not doing that. But when people are looking for, especially in hiring, extraversion, which it's a factor, although less of one than agreeableness and conscientiousness, they're typically looking for the social boldness submetric, and well, again, I'm very high in that. But that's like, in some ways, the most straightforward, and it's certainly the easiest to fix. Like, once you know this is an issue, because being what I've called a talkative introvert is common with autistic people, you could just design a slightly modified metric that has more questions on the social boldness metric, break that out from the rest of extraversion, and it should work fine and be equally predictive. When it comes to agreeability and conscientiousness, which, as I've said, are also the two biggest factors in terms of employability, that's where things start to get complicated. And I'll start with agreeability, because that is basically, so that's a double-edged sword, because on one hand, as an autistic person, I am like bad at predicting how things I'm saying are going to be received. I've gotten better, but it's been through what Daniel Kahneman calls System 2 thinking. It's learned, and I can still just screw up kind of badly, and it will often surprise people. But on the other hand, I'm bad at understanding how I'm perceived, and this sort of does two things. So one is, when people criticize me sort of screwing up in what I say, I've taken that as a sign that I'm manifesting low agreeability. But people aren't generally saying, hey, you're doing well when you're coming across as agreeable. And so I've realized I probably underestimate how agreeable people perceive me as. But then the other thing is, generally, disagreeability is, there's a big gender divide. And so with women, you cannot be too agreeable, and some degree of disagreeableness is tolerated, but only up to a point. With men, generally, some degree of disagreeability is expected and rewarded, particularly if you are right. And if you are very right, you can get away with being very disagreeable. And so I'm someone who I'm naturally inclined to probably be like 75, 80th percentile in agreeableness. My score is based on self-report. Before my father died, again, 40th percentile, after about 60th percentile. But in men, if you are perceived as being more disagreeable, and you're perceived as being more disagreeable when you're right about stuff, that is socially rewarded. And I have had a lot of experiences in my life where I've had people come up to me and say, thank you for asking that question, or for pushing back on this thing, like we were all thinking it but afraid to say it, right? And I'm the one who does that, and that is appreciated. And I will, if I'm in a good place, I will take that well. If I'm in a bad place, I will end up interpreting that as, oh dear, I'm coming across as more disagreeable than I want, and I need to like learn to shut up more. But still, basically, between these two factors, it could be that it's a wash, and in terms of predictive reliability, my appraisal of agreeableness is predictive, especially if you're taking into account the gender element. But it could also go in both directions in terms of breaking predictive validity. And that's something I think you could probably handle if you switch from self-report to having others report. I would imagine most people who know me would rate me reasonably close within a range, although I don't really know. But this is not the case for the last factor of conscientious, and this is where it gets really broken. Because basically there are three factors I have which cause me to underperform conscientiousness in terms of execution relative to how I'm trying to do, and then two factors that lead to me overperforming, which until very recently I was not aware of. And I was not aware of these three factors impeding me, but I was very aware of the consequences, which is why I typically tended to score about 30th percentile in conscientiousness before my father died. And that 10% improvement to 40th percentile, well, that's because, as I mentioned, my neuroticism dropped from 99th percentile to 50th percentile, roughly. And when that happened, people, for some reason, think of perfectionism as good. But I and everyone I know who's a perfectionist has this in your own head, like obsessive, self-defeating perfectionism. And that has frequently impaired my ability to get things done. And it still does, but a lot less once I dropped down in neuroticism and had less of that neurotic perfectionism. And again, still have it, still a factor, but less of a factor. And then the other two factors that impede my ability to execute relative to what I want to do. First of them are what I'd broadly call executive dysfunction issues. They include other things like task switching and time blindness, but they're all basically autism or ADHD common traits that directly impair my ability to execute on a task, even if I understand how to do it in theory. And you could divide these into a bunch of categories, but because that's sort of, again, they're all connected to autism and or ADHD, and they all impede direct execution when I understand the task, I'm treating this as one factor. And that has been frequently an obstacle to a lot of conscientiousness stuff. Like I mentioned before, my mother really wanted to make sure I was not going to do like male entitlement and just take it for granted my wife was going to clean the house, and tried obsessively to try to teach me to do stuff. And same thing with administrative stuff, like, balancing a checkbook and all, paying bills and all that stuff. And she would basically try to teach me twice, and if I didn't learn to do it the way she wanted, she would give up and grumble about that. And I was not diagnosed with ADHD. And so I've internalized like a lot of this kind of stuff. Like I am just bad at it. But in terms of like big projects, I am actually pretty good at doing them if I can get around executive dysfunction for reasons I'll get into when I talk about the three sort of countervailing factors. And then the final factor, and I've mentioned this I think on this channel, is that for most of my life, I have tried to emulate basically midwit types because I thought they were way more conscientious than I am, and they would sort of indoctrinate me in, you are no smarter than us, but we are more conscientious than you, and you need to get more like us. And what I've realized is that conscientiousness that is a very narrow conscientiousness of tell them what to do that any sort of average person, little above average intelligence could do, and they understand everything needed to do it. Whereas I think I've talked about on the channel, definitely on my blog, I've talked about the way I got diagnosed with autism at 10, at a time when most people like me were either being diagnosed with ADHD or nothing, is that in 5th grade, I had a teacher who would give assignments that had a literal meaning and a common sense meaning. And I would do the literal meaning, and she would tell me, don't be a smart aleck, do the common sense, use your common sense. And I was like, I don't see any other explanation. And that's like, obviously as an adult, I don't have that same problem, but I do have the problem of not understanding that I don't know what I don't know that neurotypical people know about the task. And so a lot of tasks, I have either had this thing where I will struggle to even get started because there is something that everyone's treating as basic, which probably is basic, but I'm not understanding crucial factors. And I would need to have like maybe 2 half-hour conversations with someone, 2 or 3 maybe, to really understand what I need to do. And then once I got started, I could do it well. Or I dramatically overperform because it was a simple task that I thought was way more complicated. And that can work in one of 2 ways. It can either I'm way later than they wanted me to be, or it's just delivering stuff they didn't want, it's annoying. But also, they can look at it and they're like, wait, I didn't know that was possible, but this is exactly what I wanted. And especially if I wasn't late, or I wasn't later than like the average person would be. And then that benefits me, but it's not a factor that I've really appreciated when I have rated my own conscientiousness. And I didn't really appreciate it until I was getting laid off, and people kept commenting on me doing that kind of thing. And I'm like, oh, I guess people appreciate that. And then the other thing that I've realized is that I am fundamentally just a more competent person than the average person, like better at getting stuff done and doing it well, once I understand what the task is and what I need to do it. And so between these 2 factors, you could basically, and as I mentioned, with the introversion extraversion thing, you just add the social boldness metric and you would probably predict people like me relatively well. With agreeability, you use other people rating me as opposed to self-report. That would probably work pretty well. But with conscientiousness, because you have 3 factors that impair my ability to execute relative to most people, and 2 factors that let me do dramatically better than most people, you could probably get, ask someone who has only seen me like fail a task because I didn't understand what I didn't know, and they will rate me possibly lower conscientiousness than I rate myself. You talk to people who have seen me primarily overperforming because I didn't understand the task, or just being generally more competent because I understood the task, and they're going to rate my conscientiousness extremely high. And in between, you'll have the people who might rate my conscientiousness in the middle, but also realize it's not the result of not like being internally conscientious, but there's some external factor, which is actually internal factors that I just didn't recognize usually, and give me the benefit of the doubt for it. So I would expect that if you tried to, again, you could fix the introversion, extroversion for someone like me just by adding that extra social boldness scale. You could fix the agreeableness, I think, by having other people rate me. But if you tried to have other people rate me for conscientiousness, you're probably going to completely break the reliability, which, as I said, is the biggest factor in, is a psychometric instrument good? Because not only would different people rate me differently, but someone who had worked with me on a project that went well might rate me extremely high in conscientiousness, and then if there was a project where I screwed up, might suddenly rate me way lower, and it would seem like I was jumping all over the map with different people or the same people at different times. And that doesn't mean that these metrics aren't still useful for most people, particularly when it comes to predicting your own life success. Again, neuroticism, I've argued with someone about this because she's argued that it's good for women to be a little bit neurotic like we expect it with kids, but there's still no benefit to being more than like maybe 50th percentile in neuroticism for anyone. And generally, you probably, if you're high in neuroticism, want to get it down. And then the other factors, extraversion, conscientiousness, tend to predict professional success and life satisfaction, with agreeableness also being a factor and openness being pretty irrelevant. So sort of unfortunate that I have maxed out openness like the least relevant factor, but I still, overall, despite a lot of setbacks, my life is probably going better than the average person, and especially my future, I think, is going better. And so anyways, I wanted to introduce this because I think people, again, really, they overestimate the value of IQ tests, and particularly for life success, and underestimate the value of the big five, and also talk about how I break it. So still don't take it too seriously, because these can be concerns. But as I said, at least two of these factors, well, three of them, if you're doing self-report, are reliable, even if they might not be valid. When I talk about IQ, that will be the one where I'm actually breaking reliability, which is the bigger indictment of psychometric instruments, and that is well known, which doesn't mean IQ isn't useful for some things. It's just not useful for the kind of things that people think it is. And for a lot of the things people associate with IQ, what is actually more useful is the Big Five personality test, again, in Western countries, and cross-culturally, it reduces to either the two factors of dominance and affiliation, or the three factors of dynamism, affiliation, and order. Oh, and again, my blog post is going to be in the description, along with relevant Spencer Greenberg articles and videos sort of explaining the basics here. So thanks for watching. I'm Magpie, and I'll see y'all in the next one.